These people are Afrikaners, white South Africans of mixed Dutch, German, and French descent. They've been called the lost white tribe of Africa. Their peculiar genius has been survival. Against all odds, they have clung doggedly to the portion of Africa they claim as their own. Afrikaners will tell you that, unlike English-speaking South Africans, they have nowhere else to go. Their home and their destiny lie in South Africa.
We do not want to run any unnecessary risks. We as Afrikaners, as the most important decision makers, must create the necessary safeguards that the society as it is must be continued, that our existence as whites in Africa must be permanent.
Afrikaners say they are tough and pragmatic, but they may in fact be the last romantics. To understand the present South African situation, apartheid, white intransigence, it is necessary to know how the Afrikaner character developed and how this people came to power. The Voortrekker Monument outside South Africa's capital, Pretoria, is a shrine to Afrikaner nationalism, the Afrikaners' highly emotional sense of being a unique people, the folk, with a special destiny in Africa. Afrikaners have a peculiar mythology derived from their uncompromising religious and racial beliefs, and a pioneering history. For them, the past lives on and dictates the decisions of the present. The Voortrekker Monument is enclosed in a circle of covered wagons, known as a Laager. For Afrikaners, the central image in their historical memory is this Laager, an armed camp surrounded by enemies, with guns poking out from behind the covered wagons. In the 3 centuries that the Afrikaner has been in Africa, this image of the Laager has changed, but it is still alive. For the Laager is above all a state of mind which sees enemies everywhere and tries to protect against them.
Numerically, of course, the Afrikaner constitutes a very small group. And secondly, we feel as a group that we are being threatened by outside forces. We perceive the outside world, or we used to perceive the outside world, as being hostile in a sense to us.
The earliest form of the Laager was a prickly hedge planted by the first Dutch settlers around their tiny settlement at the southwest tip of Africa to keep out Hottentots. Thus, from the beginning, they established a racial barrier between those of European origin, the Boers, and native Africans, whom the Boers called Kaffers, unbelievers. In an age of slavery, the Boer farmer used slave labor. He became essentially an overseer who shunned the manual work of his slaves. His rigid Calvinism told him that his mission in Africa was to protect white Christian civilization from the barbarian.
One should remember that the Afrikaners regarded themselves just like the New Englanders as a chosen people, you know. This is rooted in the Old Testament, in Protestant religion, Calvinism especially. And in the interior of South Africa, they only had the Bible as literature because of their isolation from the West and from the mother country. Or, well, they were actually cut off from Holland. So they got their ideas directly from the Bible. Some ideas in regard even to the non-whites, which they regard as Canaanites, and themselves as a chosen people with a mission.
The Afrikaner's dilemma was this. He has needed black muscles to work the land for him, but he has always lived in fear that those same muscles would one day take the land from him. This created a push-pull effect. Keep the Kafir in his place, and his place is working for the white boss. In the 19th century, British imperial rule expanded to southern Africa. They interfered very little with the frontier life of the Boers until 1834, when they ordered the abolition of slavery. For Afrikaners, this meant the ruin of their economy based on slave labor. And it was seen as a first step towards miscegenation, which would destroy them as a people, a folk. In 1836, in an extraordinary gesture of self-reliance and courage, 2,000 Boers crossed the Orange River into the wilderness, out of the bondage of British rule, searching for free land in which to form a republic. This movement northwards is called the Great Trek. Not all the Boers trekked out. Most remained behind under British rule. This split among Afrikaners was to persist for a century. Those who trekked had to be tough to survive. Called the Voortrekkers, they have a romantic place in the hearts of Afrikaners.
They were pioneers to the backbone, and it was just rough going. They were tough men coming down the mountains. My grandmother, when I was still a youngster, told me how her father and her grandfather told her how they came down the mountains by stripping the wheels off and skidding the wagons down the Drakensberg. And where it was very steep, they used to put the two big wheels on the one side and the two small wheels, because the wagon has two small wheels in front and two big wheels at the back. And this is how they sort of balanced out. And they went over the Drakensberg in the same spirit. They were really opening up Africa, as a matter of fact.
The Voortrekkers pushed into lands the Zulu considered theirs, and the many clashes are the fabric of Afrikaner mythology, in which the savagery and treachery of the Africans are contrasted with the heroism of the Voortrekkers. According to the Afrikaner version of history, in 1838 a Boer party of 500 faced a Zulu army 10,000 strong. At the end of the battle, a nearby river ran red with the blood of 3,000 Zulus, slain by Boer cannon and muskets. The Boers, fighting for the Laager, had not lost a single man. Blood River showed what a small band of disciplined and well-armed men could accomplish. The lesson has not been forgotten. Today, the white man in South Africa rules because he has the guns, and he's willing to use them. In the wilderness, the Boers established their independent republics, the Orange Free State and the Transvaal, each with its elected president. The Constitution of the Transvaal stated that the people desire no equality between the colored people and the white inhabitants, either in church or state. But the Boers' farm economy continued to depend on black labor. It was the Boers' misfortune that the Transvaal contained the richest gold deposits in the world, the Rand. The Boers had trekked over half of southern Africa to get away from the British. Now the British coveted the gold-rich Transvaal. The Boers could either capitulate or fight. They chose to fight the foremost imperialist power in the world to keep their republic. The Boers knew the terrain, were highly mobile, tough, and resourceful. Above all, they were fighting for their homeland, against bands of commandos who probably totaled no more than 40,000 at any one time. The British sent over 250,000 troops. The British waged an incompetent and bungling campaign and stumbled their way to victory. Frustration at the commandos' success drove the British to burn the Boer farms, the source of the guerrillas' food supplies. They herded the homeless women and children into concentration camps. Only 5,000 Boers died in battle, but in the camps, in appalling conditions, 5,000 adults died and 20,000 children. For Afrikaners, the Laager, the armed camp, is the symbol of invincibility. The concentration camp, the symbol of their degradation. In 1902, in order to survive as a folk, the Boers had to surrender. Over half a century later, Afrikaners erected a memorial to their defeat. A fallen warrior lies with a dagger in his heart, but from the heart springs a powerful spirit of steel, a gleaming sword in his hand, representing the rise of a new, triumphant Afrikaner nation. In victory, the British imposed a parliamentary system on South Africa, excluding most non-whites. But Afrikaners outnumbered those of British origin. They might win by the ballot what they had lost by the bullet if they could apply the motto of their lost republic: unity makes strength. In 1914, the National Party was formed to build Afrikaner unity against continuing British domination. Its leader, General Hertzog, whose slogan was "South Africa first." Hertzog had said, Only one person has the right to be boss in South Africa, namely the Afrikaner. The people feel their own power. They have reached nation manhood, and they feel that Afrikaners and not strangers should rule the country. The devastation of the Anglo-Boer War had created a class of poor whites who scraped subsistence from the soil. Destitute, virtually their one remaining possession was their white skin. During the early decades of this century, drought and soil erosion drove these poor white Afrikaners off their land into the cities they looked upon as the devil's own, seeking the very manual jobs they had despised as fit only for blacks. This mass migration became known as the Second Great Trek. But in the cities, Afrikaners were strangers in their own country. South Africa's economic strength lay in her mines: diamonds, gold, coal, iron ore. And the mines were British-owned. White workers, called civilized labor, had always been paid more than blacks and had all the best jobs. The myth of racial superiority paid off in hard cash. But in 1921, the price of gold fell. Mine owners said they had to cut costs by employing cheaper blacks in jobs reserved for whites only. The white miners, terrified by what they called the Black Peril, seized the British mines. Their slogan was, "Workers of the world unite to keep South Africa white." The government crushed the revolt. The strikers were bombed, shelled, and machine-gunned into submission. More than 200 whites died. 4 of the rebellion's leaders went to the gallows singing the red flag. The white miners had been broken. But within 2 years, white workers voted General Hertzog into power. Hertzog promised protection against both British capitalists and competition from blacks. During the 20s and 30s, the government established powerful state monopolies like Iscor, the Iron and Steel Corporation of South Africa, to break the British monopoly of economic power.
After all, Afrikaners have essentially, over this period of this century, since the Boer War, run a revolution against British dominance in South Africa. It's even a continuing revolution.
The color bar for the first time got the backing of law. It became illegal for a black man to lay a brick. By the end of the 30s, Afrikaners were finally reaching the unity which would guarantee them full political power in South Africa when Britain declared war on Germany.
And the opportunity was there in 1939 to remain neutral. But Smuts, with a very small parliamentary majority, decided that we should side with Britain and help to fight her wars again against a nation, Germany, against which we had nothing. We simply said that we should have stayed out of the war as the Irish Republic had done. That this was a repetition of the completely mistaken attitude taken up by the government in 1914. And we young people, I and thousands of others, more than 200,000 Afrikaners, formed the Osama Brandwehr and we resisted the government. We embarked on subversive schemes in order to hold within South Africa a large part of the military forces that Smuts could whip up. We were successful in many respects, but of course many of us were caught. Many prominent people now in politics in South Africa, including the Prime Minister and myself, for instance, were caught, and we were interned, and we were kept in internment during the entire course of the war.
Smuts, the Prime Minister, aware of the danger of an uprising, confiscated all privately owned weapons and interned hundreds of Afrikaners under an emergency law.
Oh yes, we were bent on revolution. We were waiting for the time when Britain would be conquered, be invaded, and would lose the war. We would seize that opportunity in order to call out a republic in South Africa and to divest ourselves completely from the bonds with the British Empire.
Afrikaners were divided once more. The nationalist leader, Dr. Malan, denounced Smuts, saying he had turned South Africa into a Jewish imperialistic war machine. Yet a majority of South Africa's fighting troops were Afrikaners. Ironically, this war, opposed so bitterly by many Afrikaners, gave the final thrust to Afrikaner nationalism. In the massive effort to feed and equip the Allies, South Africa went through a boom period. There was plenty of work, and the influx of Afrikaners to the towns increased. Blacks also flocked to the towns and took jobs previously closed to them. By 1946, there were as many blacks as whites in the towns. Dr. Malan expressed his people's shock. In that new blood river, he said, black and white meet together in much closer contact and a much more binding struggle than when 100 years ago the circle of wagons protected the Laager and musket clashed with spear. Today, black and white jostle together in the same labor market. This resurgence of the Black Peril gave the National Party the formula for victory in the first post-war election, the apartheid election of 1948. To Afrikaners, it seemed that Smuts had not only sold out to Britain, but had gone soft on the blacks. While many young Afrikaners had been willing to fight in Smuts' British wars, none wanted their racial dominance undermined in any way. This threat finally united Afrikaners. The nationalists' platform said, if we reject the master race principle, and the non-Europeans are given the vote, how can the European remain boss? The European must retain the right to rule the country and keep it a white man's country. Dr. Malan's cabinet, the first composed purely of Afrikaners, began to implement the final answer to the Black Peril, apartheid, the complete separation of blacks from the white Laager. Discrimination had always existed in South Africa, whatever white group was in power, but the nationalists now institutionalized it, depriving non-whites of any expectation of ever achieving equality with whites.
Of course, given the situation as we find it here in South Africa, we had to exploit alternative means to solve the problems or to restructure society without endangering the future of the whites. I mean, basically one may dither about it, but it is a matter of white survival. And in that phrase, I include very strongly Afrikaner survival.
The emotional strength of Afrikaner nationalism was evident in 1949, when 250,000 Afrikaners made a triumphal pilgrimage to the Voortrekker Monument. Now united, the folk would decide South Africa's destiny. The years of division, of second-class citizenship, had conditioned Afrikaners to thinking of themselves as a people besieged. Built like a fortress, the Voortrekker Monument symbolized not just a people, but the state as Laager. South Africa was an independent country within the British Commonwealth, but it was still subject to the Crown, a figurehead hated by nationalists, whose memory stretched back to the Anglo-Boer War, the concentration camps, and the lost republics. Yet Afrikaners in their thousands welcomed the royal family. While the British connection was there, Afrikaner loyalties would remain divided. So, in 1960, the nationalists held a referendum on whether South Africa should become a republic, no longer tied to Britain. English South Africans felt that this was the first step towards complete isolation from the rest of the world, and the bitter debate split the country, English versus Afrikaans. The nationalists carried the day. The Anglo-Boer War was finally won 60 years later by the Boers. That same year, 1960, British Prime Minister Macmillan spoke before Parliament in Cape Town at the end of an African tour. He warned that black nationalism was sweeping Africa.
And the most striking of all the impressions that I've formed since I left London a month ago is of the strength of this African national consciousness. The wind of change is blowing through this continent. And whether we like it or not, this growth of national consciousness is a political fact.
Macmillan's speech was prophetic. Within 2 months, Sharpeville. A crowd of unarmed blacks demonstrating against the pass laws which restricted their freedom of movement were fired upon by the South African police. 69 were killed, 180 wounded. This was not the first time whites had shot down blacks, but Afrikaners saw it as a new threat. They had defeated the British only to be confronted with an ultimately more formidable enemy, the old black peril in the shape of black African nationalism. The National Party pervades Afrikaner society, from the grassroots level to the so-called Brotherhood, a secret society said to make all the important policy decisions in South Africa. The party is intimately linked to the Dutch Reformed Church, to the schools and universities, cultural organizations, certain trade unions, and Afrikaans newspapers. In addition, the nationalists have packed all branches of government with their supporters: the civil service, the police, military leadership, judgeships, prison warders, the secret police, are overwhelmingly Afrikaner. Out of a small white population of 4 million, there are over 1 million more Afrikaners than English speakers. With their ability to mobilize the Afrikaner vote and to a large degree mold public opinion, the nationalists increased their share of the popular vote throughout the 60s. They rendered all other parties impotent and even outlawed some. Once in power, the National Party controlled the law-making process. Immediately, it began to manipulate the law, making it the major weapon of the Laager. Every aspect of human activity, sport, sex, education, politics, was controlled. With every law enacted, the freedom of the individual was whittled away. The one standard the nationalists have set for themselves, by which everything is judged, is the security of the state. And since 1948, the state has meant the Afrikaner folk.
That is the sole responsibility of the governing party and the people that govern. Because they know everything that's going on, they have been placed there by the people, and they have to see that the safety of the people, which is to them a holy matter placed in their hands, must not be in jeopardy. And therefore it is their full responsibility to decide at what stage the ordinary rights of the individual should and can and must be curtailed.
There was protest after protest by black and white South Africans, but even protest became, in many ways, equated with treason.
Unless you disperse immediately, I shall have to use force to disperse you.
Despite their own experience as revolutionaries, the Afrikaner nationalists felt no sympathy for black nationalists. They saw them as rivals for political power, to be suppressed at all costs. Foremost among the National Party's measures to quell opposition was the Suppression of Communism Act of 1950. By this act, communism was defined so broadly as to include anything or anyone advocating racial equality.
And therefore, any concept, even a Christian concept, where on the basis of one's Christian belief you withstand the policy of separate development, could be seen, to be an offense under the Suppression of Communism Act.
In December 1956, in a nationwide roundup, the South African government arrested 156 persons of all races on charges of treason. The accused had called for equal rights for all citizens, black and white. The prosecution argued that this was incitement to violence, for by Afrikaner logic, racial equality in South Africa could only be achieved by violence. The Laager would allow for change in no other way.
An act of intimidation to scare away anybody who might toy with the idea of using communist or communist ideology or tactics in order to subvert the state. The courts, by and large, view and interpret the definition of communism in the light of the possible dangers that might arise if persons pursue the line of conduct that they are charged with.
control of subversive thoughts is as vital as control of subversive acts. For Afrikaners, communism is the Antichrist, and liberal thinking will lead to the destruction of the race. Afrikaners have a term for those outside the Lager. Volksvijand, an enemy of the people. A Volksvijand need commit no crime. Suspicion that he has thought or done something the authorities do not like is enough. For enemies of the people, the nationalists introduced a unique punishment, banning, a form of excommunication. No trial, no appeal to the courts. One man makes the decision, the Minister of Justice.
Banning is a term which is used under the Suppression of Communism Act, whereby a person is prohibited from seeing more than one individual at a time. He is prohibited from entering any building where educational material is being prepared or printed or published or distributed. He is prevented from entering any building where a trade union is registered, where he is prevented from entering any area which is prohibited to him, like for instance an African township. He is not allowed to attend any gatherings, including social and political gatherings. He is forced into a situation of spiritual and mental and emotional isolation. He has to live on his own inner resources. He feels that he is rejected by society, and therefore, as a result of that, he simply feels that he withdraws into himself and is not able to live as a normal human being. In fact, it becomes a subhuman existence.
As Afrikaners during the Second World War had resorted to sabotage against the legitimate government, so did those who opposed the government in the early 60s. Because lawful protest seemed closed to them, young English and Jewish South Africans committed a number of acts of sabotage which were used by the government to further justify suppression of dissent. The next wave of active resistance was ideologically different, involving black and white leaders like Nelson Mandela and Bram Fischer, who turned out to be the head of the South African Communist Party.
But they sat down beforehand and calculated very carefully the risks involved, the line of action to be taken, weighed the pros and cons of every possible situation that could evolve, and acted accordingly. And when they were caught, there was an incredible sense of dignity about the whole proceeding. They, not for a moment, contemplated denying what they had done. They made it very clear that there were no other courses of action open to them in the circumstances. South Africa was heading downhill in an absolutely destructive, negative enforcement of rigid apartheid. And the only way in which they found or thought that they could change society was through violent measures.
For Afrikaners, the most important figure in this group of revolutionaries was Bram Fischer. He was one of Afrikanerdom's brilliant men, grandson of a leading statesman, son of a judge-president, himself a former leader of the Johannesburg Bar. For this man to be head of the Communist Party of South Africa was a treacherous fault in the Lager.
I think it would be correct to say that Fischer is regarded by the vast majority of Afrikaners as a traitor, not only to the Afrikaans cause, but also to the Christian faith.
At his trial, Fischer quoted the words of Paul Kruger, the Boer leader in the struggle against the British. With confidence, we lay our case before the whole world. Whether we win or die, freedom will rise in Africa, like the sun from the morning clouds. President Kruger had been talking of freedom for the white Afrikaner. Fischer was talking about freedom for the black African. Fischer was given a life sentence. He contracted cancer, and after lengthy petitioning by his family, was released from jail to die. After his cremation, Minister of Justice Kruger, concerned that his grave would become a martyr's shrine, demanded the return of his ashes. Since Fischer was a criminal, he said, they belonged to the state. In the mid-60s, Fischer was virtually the only Afrikaner speaking against the Lager. But by the time of his death in 1975, the voices of Afrikaners dissenting had multiplied. Breiten Breitenbach, foremost Afrikaans poet of his generation, married a Vietnamese woman in Paris. home with his wife to receive a poetry prize, the full meaning of apartheid struck him. The law forbade their living together. In Europe, he criticized the nationalist government. Returning secretly, he was arrested. At his trial, he was accused of helping form a secret organization, of speaking in Paris against the South African government, of recruiting trade unionists, of inciting people to send letters. He was sentenced to 9 years in jail.
I believe it has the highest prison population in the free world, so-called free world.
Though a leading Afrikaans writer, Professor Brink is outspoken enough to be censored. South African censorship is severe. Some 20,000 books are banned outright.
Which, to me, are just a few symptoms of what essentially is a violent society. And apartheid, to me, is essentially just this, the legalizing and the legitimizing of violence in a sort of institutionalized form, so that everything relies on violence.
I've expressed my very strong convictions about any communist ideology being acceptable in our country. Stated it very clearly that I totally reject it. But I do wish to make the point that as far as the black society of South Africa is concerned, increasingly there is growing the belief that some form of African socialism is needed and will be acceptable to them. And my plea is that we as whites participate in the debate and the discussion with the leaders of our black community, to listen and to hear what they are saying, to understand.
Dr. Beyers Naudé was a minister in high standing of the Dutch Reformed Church, but this position was taken from him when he became head of the Christian Institute, which is dedicated to racial equality. Dr. Naudé is an outspoken critic of the South African government on moral grounds. With his impeccable religious and political background, he is considered by that government as all the more treacherous. He is one of the few Afrikaners trusted by blacks. Intellectuals have historically formed an elite within Afrikanerdom. It is a special shock when men such as Naudé, Brink, and Breitenbach make a stand against nationalist policies.
And if we are wise enough, we will look ahead and we will say, let us work this out together.
It is accepted that every state is entitled, in exceptional circumstances, to take exceptional measures to preserve its own security.
South Africa believes it is a nation under siege, from without and within. In this belief, the Minister of Justice wields overwhelming powers.
You know, here, under the Internal Security Bill, the minister, in his own right, you know, can decide whether he detains somebody indefinitely. It just puts him away. He disappears for a year. No charge, no possibility of him, for instance, you know, being able to appeal to the court of law. It's the right of the individual to decide the future of a man.
The Minister of Justice need not notify relatives of those arrested or reveal their names. He has threatened newspapers which do publish the names of those detained under the Internal Security Bill. Because of the weakness of the opposition parties, the only effective stand against the government has come from the English language press of South Africa. The nationalists have condemned it, calling it not a fourth estate, but a fifth column.
You can look at the propaganda that's being used against South Africa, and mostly it comes from within South Africa itself.
In June 1976, a man died after falling from the 5th floor of police headquarters in Johannesburg shortly after his arrest. In 1975 alone, 85 people died in their first week of imprisonment. Torture of prisoners is widely reported.
And 5 years ago, the newspapers, certainly the English newspapers in this country, would have kicked up a hell of a rumpus about this. Now, they prepare to keep it down and hide it in tiny little notices somewhere in the middle pages of a newspaper, instead of really forcing the government to reveal something about this and to get to the bottom of it.
Freedom of the press has been drastically curtailed by threats and indictments against courageous newsmen. To avoid official censorship, the once powerful English language press now censors itself rigorously. During the Black Riots of 1976, a number of reporters like Peter Magubane, were beaten and imprisoned without charge because their reporting embarrassed the government. Free reporting and criticism are treated as a threat to national security. It has been said that white South Africans have a passion for security rather than liberty. In their efforts to ensure that security, Afrikaner nationalists have imprisoned thousands, driven thousands more into exile. In trying to safeguard the Lager, the laws of Afrikanerdom have created innumerable enemies dedicated to its destruction. During the quarter of a century that Afrikaner nationalists have ruled South Africa, the lot of the Afrikaner has improved considerably. When the Afrikaners began their second great trek off the land, the cities were places of poverty and humiliation. Now, those cities provide a comfortable and protected life. Where once they were strangers, they are now at home. In South Africa, they speak of the new Afrikaner. School kids in small country towns still go barefoot, but now it is not because they can't afford shoes. A farmer whose grandfather probably was not much better off than his black neighbor now flies his own plane. There are more Afrikaans than English universities. Economically, Afrikaners are catching up on the English South Africans. The descendants of the four truckers have come a long way, but they have not forgotten the covered wagon and the Lager.
All of them are naturally anxious, worried about being plowed under, as they would call it, by the blacks if they should come into power.
In their minds remains the fear of one final great trek, the flight of the Afrikaner out of Africa. North of Pretoria, within the confines of a native reserve, lies the village of Ndebele. Picturesque, it is an attractive spot for white tourists who pay a government tax for a visitor's permit. When they see tourists, the girls of Ndebele quit their games to strip for white men's cameras. The show village of Ndebele is very much the ordinary Afrikaner's idyll of a native homeland. Unspoiled, colorful, the natives busy with their handicrafts. Obviously, it will take the natives several hundred years to reach the level of the white man. In the meantime, they are poor but contented. Ndebele is a tribal entity, a small group of people, powerless, no threat to the white man.
We know that if there is not the strength of will on the part of the Afrikaner to follow the course he's chosen and to do it to a certain extent ruthlessly, although I would say he will always try to justify it vis-a-vis certain moral principles. But if this is missing, I mean, we have lost. Then we must capitulate. Then we have no policy.
The Afrikaner's policy for salvation is apartheid, the separation of black from white. Apartheid divides South Africa into one white country and 9 black homelands. Afrikaners argue that blacks belong in these tribal homelands, though most black people do not live there. Thus, on an unprecedented scale, Afrikaners are depriving 17 million of their countrymen of their citizenship, making them strangers in their own country.
You cannot bring together, which is so totally different. The Afrikaner is of European stock, our traditions are European, but we evolved a different set of traditions to suit our being an African people now. And we differ from the English in small respects, but we differ very greatly from the other peoples who inhabit this country.
Yes, I think that each man has been given his piece of country and the right to vote in his country, and that is fair. Because if you have to put, if we have to say one man, one vote in South Africa and just leave it open, then the white is not going to get a fair share because he has contributed economically to making this country what it is today. And if you say tomorrow, one man, one vote, then he doesn't, there is no chance for him. So it's better that each person be given the chance to have his piece of country and decide how he wants to live and what he wants to do with his country there.
In fact, black South Africans have never been consulted on any of the laws governing them. At a time when blacks are losing a tribal identity and gaining a national consciousness, Afrikaners are trying to force re-tribalization upon them. Presented by Afrikaners as a just solution to each group its own country, the details of apartheid reveal something else. Apartheid reserves 87% of the land for 4 million whites, 13% for 17 million blacks. By the end of the century, the black population will have increased to 30 million. Their land will not increase. That is not all. The 87% of the land reserved for whites contains virtually all the enormous mineral wealth, all the industry, all the harbors, and almost all the road and rail communications. Not one of the so-called black homelands is now a viable economic unit, or can expect to be within the foreseeable future. A map of the homelands looks like a crazy jigsaw puzzle of pieces that will never fit together. Within South Africa, the white Laager is to remain the strongest power bloc, with the other black units forever fragmented and powerless. What was done to their forebears 3/4 of a century ago, Afrikaners are now doing to others on a vaster scale. In the government's terms, this is the sanitary eradication of black spots, involving the mass deportation from their homes of millions of black people to what have been called dumping grounds. There is no work, medical services are few, malnutrition and infant mortality are commonplace. Conditions resemble nothing so much as the concentration camps of the Anglo-Boer War, which Afrikaners themselves call an attempt at genocide.
The Afrikaner is the instrument of change. We know, or we think, that we are in the best position to bring about the changes within the framework we have chosen. So it's inevitable that there will be spillovers and fall-offs, etc., etc. And we are trying to tell the world, in spite of the situation as it is, please judge us also on our intentions, because our intentions are good and they can be explained in terms of Christian moral principles as you follow them. But of course, this all will take time.
But the world's mistrust of apartheid is caused by this glaring contradiction. The nationalists proclaim that their policy is to separate black from white. Yet the present and future prosperity of the Afrikaner depends on cheap black labor. In the mines, whites work side by side with blacks, but whites earn 10 times as much for that work. On the farms, which provide white families with their cheap food, a black farm worker receives perhaps $300 a year. He can never own the land he works. Almost every white child has its black nanny, almost every white family its servants, who earn around $40 a month for long and ill-defined hours. Black workers have practically no rights, least of all the right to strike. For 100 years, there has been a black working class in South Africa, yet when Afrikaners speak of blacks, they still speak in stereotypes.
According to the tribal custom, over all the centuries, the black man was the warrior and his wife had to till the lands and look after the cattle. So they're used to that way of life. And if the chief can drink beer and the wife work, he's satisfied and he doesn't want to work.
Because of the country's tremendous economic boom, based largely on cheap black labor, the number of blacks living in white South Africa has not decreased as promised by the nationalists, but actually increased since the introduction of apartheid in 1948.
These are the people who have built South Africa into a modern industrial giant. South Africans of all colors and creeds, sharing the rewards of a free enterprise economy.
This government film tells a half-truth. Rapid economic growth has offered more jobs to non-whites, but they are prevented by law from competing in an open job market with whites. In the event of a recession, blacks are the first to lose their jobs, cushioning the impact on whites. Apartheid, the desire to push the black away, has always been tempered by the demands of the economy to increase the prosperity of the Afrikaner folk. In this upward movement, some of the black working class has inevitably risen too. This makes the Laager vulnerable. A more skilled, better educated black workforce could unite for higher wages and political power. To prevent this, the government enforces tribal divisions that often erupt into gang warfare and murder. During the Soweto riots in 1976, Zulu migrant workers were pitted by the police against other workers and schoolboys trying to organize a strike. Because of white dependence on black labor, complete separation of the races has never been achieved in South Africa. Instead, blacks are forced to live in satellite townships outside South Africa's cities. They have few amenities and are riddled with crime and violence, giving South Africa the highest murder rate in the world. Yet the efforts of the police are directed not at protecting blacks, but at controlling them. 500,000 blacks are prosecuted each year for unlawful movement. It has turned much of the black laboring class into criminals. Within the system of apartheid as now practiced, the homelands are breeding grounds of migrant labor for white South Africa, while the black townships are vast labor camps. Afrikaners are the warders. Ever since the Voortrekkers, where the leader of the pioneer column was directly responsible for its survival, Afrikaner leaders have been thought to embody the will of the people. In South Africa, leaders of the National Party are selected above all for their ability to hold the party together. Afrikaners, with their Laager mentality, believe that without unity, survival is impossible.
And ladies and gentlemen, this government, this nationalist party has been governing South Africa for 26 years under very difficult circumstances in the face of a hostile world. And I say to you, apart from anything else, the merit of the National Party lies in the fact that it has been able to hold this fort South Africa for 26 years in the face of all these difficulties.
The National Party's appeal to English-speaking South Africans as well as Afrikaners has lain in its power to maintain white dominance and white security. In the 1974 election, white South Africans endorsed firm nationalist government by returning it to a 26th year of unbroken power. The day after the election, their security was undermined completely. The coup in Portugal, 5,000 miles away, brought an anti-colonialist regime resolved to withdraw from its African territories. At one blow, South Africa lost 2 of her buffer states, Mozambique and Angola, and the Laager was brought face to face with militant black African nationalism, which South Africa equates with communism.
The position today in Africa is that the black breeds and the whites feed. And we prefer prosperity and peace and development. But now the communists, they breed hate, they supply weapons. You open the way for socialistic states on the communist pattern, and the communists are training these people in communism, taking all the young people over to Russia for training, as has been done in Angola and Mozambique.
In Angola, the civil war threatened to bring victory to the Russian-backed MPLA. Isolated at the foot of the continent, South Africa has always relied heavily upon Western support. Western countries invest substantially in South Africa, supply her with weapons, and veto efforts to sanction her in the United Nations. Without this bulwark, the Laager would crumble.
On the contrary, Expulsion would be all too likely to encourage the most illiberal elements in South Africa to take refuge in their famous Lager of earlier times.
Aware that her survival depends on this unspoken alliance, over the years, South Africa has carried on a massive public relations campaign to convince the West that South Africa is strategically vital and a trusty ally in the struggle with communism.
South Africa is ready to play a part in defense of the free world we know and about which we care. Her striking power on land, sea, and air is there to be shared by all those committed to the desire for a world at peace.
In the United States of 1975, the South Africans found a powerful friend who, like them, feared communist influence in Africa. Calling for an anti-communist crusade, South Africa entered the Angolan Civil War. But the American Congress refused to furnish funds for further CIA involvement in Angola. Left alone to face the MPLA, the victorious Angolan faction, and its Cuban ally, the South African forces withdrew. They left behind white prisoners of war in the hands of black men. For those outside the Lager, the myth of white South African invincibility had been broken.
The Angolan situation has brought South Africa, in a certain sense, to a crisis in its whole life and in its existence. And South Africa will never be the same again. The whole Angolan event brought home to the white community the vulnerability of our whole situation and the possible threat which now might emerge from the north, threatening the present political and economic status quo of South Africa. As far as the blacks are concerned, it has brought an upsurge of hope and expectation.
Encircled by black enemies its own policies had created, the Lager erupted within. But Afrikaners still held the weapons. The result was killing of unarmed civilians, including children. For Afrikaner nationalists, the disturbances that swept the country in the South African winter of 1976 were above all else bad public relations. The actual threat to internal security was not great. Afrikaners were willing to pay a very high price in lives, as long as they were black lives. But far more damaging was the threat to business confidence in South Africa. It was starkly revealed that any continuing strike by black workers could break the South African economy. And because of apartheid, their politics of exclusion, Afrikaners had no dialogue with black nationalists except force.
And all I say as an Afrikaner, as we once did when a white nation, namely the British, wanted to take us over, we got news for you. And as much as we had news for the British, granted we lost, so we will have news against those black South Africans who want to take us over. And in that sense, taking the matter to a crunch, we will and must necessarily, if we believe in the survival of our nation, fight them off.
No form of nationalism which is designed to ensure its own survival and its own security, can tolerate another form of nationalism which threatens it. Afrikaner nationalism is the urge in the Afrikaner to secure his identity, to secure his future, to secure his dominance, because he believes that only in that is he able to continue to exist as an Afrikaner and maintain his identity. Therefore, if African or black nationalism emerges as a possible threat to that concept, the Afrikaner will try everything in his power to crush that black nationalism. He will not succeed. In the same way as the British, when they tried to impose, their form of British imperialism upon the Afrikaner, did not succeed. The tragedy is the Afrikaner doesn't realize that in the same way as the British were not able to impose their concept of nationalism upon him, in the same way his attempts at ensuring his own safety in this way and his security, that they will fail miserably.
The architect of the new Afrikaans University in Johannesburg intended it to be a summation of the spirit of Afrikanerdom. But from the outside, this place of learning turns out to be, once again, only a Lager, whose massive walls defy a hostile world in a last-ditch stand. The interior holds a greater shock. For this bastion, which protects young Afrikaners from the outside world and molds their minds, is not only their lager, but their prison.